3.5 The forces behind the decline of feudalism and the rise of markets. The major changes that eroded the institutions of feudalism and created the conditions for the development of markets were changes in technology, urbanization and specialization, increased long-distance trade, the Crusades, the establishment of the nation-state, exploration and colonization, the rise of Protestantism, the development of early manufacturing and factories, the monetization of the economy, and the establishment of private property rights. The section below describes these changes and how they moved the feudal economies of Europe toward the market capitalist system of mercantilism. One crucial change that prompted many of the other changes was the increase in the surplus of food that occurred when better agricultural technology was developed. 1. An increase in the surplus from improvements in agricultural technology. In an agriculturally based economy, agricultural technology is the primary determinant of the amount of surplus a community has. Yearly planting of the same crops in the same soil eventually depletes the land and can even render the land unusable. To avoid this problem, farmers had developed a system where land would be used to grow crops one year, but then it would lie fallow, unused, the next year to allow the soil to recover. Eventually, around the year 1000, a three-field crop rotation system was developed. A grain, rye or winter wheat, would be planted in one field in the fall, a second crop, peas, oats, or beans, would be planted in a second field in the spring and a third field would lie fallow. Rotating crops between these three uses improved the health of the soil, and the land only had to lie fallow 1/3 of the time instead of half of the time. Productivity increased significantly, generating additional food that could support more people. And surplus grains that could support more horses and other farm animals. Horses not only made farming more productive, but they could be used to transport goods for trade. With the rise in food production, Europe's population doubled between 1000 and 1300, and, as a consequence, there was a significant increase in urbanization. 2. Urbanization and specialization. The towns of Europe began to grow steadily as food supplies increased. Since they existed outside of the influence of the feudal lords, who controlled rural areas but not the towns, the urban areas were forced to develop their own codes of law, monetary system, and governing institutions. For their survival they depended on local trade, which meant that they needed to produce specialized goods that the rural areas needed and would buy in exchange for food. Greater surpluses and better transportation made trade easier, encouraging still more specialization and exchange. Local trade grew steadily, but it was carefully regulated by town officials to preserve stability, especially jobs, incomes, and food supplies. Long-distance trade, on the other hand, was the province of international traveling merchants and was not subject to the same regulation. 3. Long-distance trade and traveling merchants. Traveling merchants became more prominent from 700–1300. Originally, they traded spices, salted fish, wine, and goods that were only produced in certain places, dyes, special cloth, fine metal work, etc. As trade routes became more established, around the 1400s, permanent markets featuring goods from distant lands became a feature of towns. Regions of Europe began to specialize increasingly in the production of specific types of goods, which led to improvements in skill and productivity, resulting in even more surplus to trade. Great trading cities developed to facilitate long-distance trade, and they created legal and banking systems for businesses that formed the basis for modern market capitalist systems. Further facilitating this trade was the Crusades. 4. The Crusades and the opening of Europe. From 1095–1291, hundreds of thousands of European knights and peasants traveled to the Middle East at the behest of the Catholic Church to protect Catholic interests and free the Holy Lands from non-Catholics. The Crusades were only somewhat successful militarily, and the crusading soldiers were often manipulated by the commercial interests of Venice into attacking Venetian rivals instead of their intended targets. But the major long-term effect of the Crusades was economic. Sheltered Europeans came in contact with the thriving, dynamic commercial societies of Venice and Byzantium. They were impressed by the opulent lifestyle, and they returned to Europe with spices, exotic trinkets, and tales of luxury that could be obtained by trade. Europe began to look increasingly outward. But this outward orientation required different political arrangements. 5. The rise of the nation-state and commercial interests. Trade under feudalism was a complicated affair. Every time a merchant set foot on the land of an estate or a town, he would have to pay a tax or duty of some sort. Along the German section of the Rhine in 1400, there were more than 60 toll stations. It was not uncommon for tolls to double the prices of goods as they were hauled by merchants from where they were produced to where they were sold. As trade increased in importance, merchants chafed under the stifling commercial system of feudalism. They found an ally in the kings who were looking to expand their influence over the largely independent feudal lords. Kings, with the financial support of merchants, began to expand their power and influence and develop larger and larger kingdoms. They amassed armies and built navies using the revenues from trade, stimulating manufacturing in the process. By the 1500s, Europe was a collection of nation-states with growing economic and military power under the control of kings and merchants. Kings and merchants relied on trade to generate gold and silver, which were needed for hiring mercenaries and maintaining an army and navy. Because money meant the ability to purchase military power, gold meant power, they worked incessantly to increase trade and the supply of gold as much as possible. One of the ways that they could do this was by finding new places to trade with and new sources of raw materials and gold. 6. Exploration and colonization by nation-states. While some exploration did occur during feudalism, it took the concentrated power and wealth of the new kings of Europe to undertake large-scale exploration. Kings outfitted fleets for exploration under the direction of the likes of Vasco da Gama, Portugal, Christopher Columbus, Spain, John Cabot, England, Jacques Cartier, France, and Oliver van Noort, the Netherlands. In addition to exotic goods and trade routes, explorers sought gold, silver, and slaves to pay off the high costs of these ventures and to support the kings who financed them. Christopher Columbus's log describing his landing in the Bahamas, quoted in Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, illustrates the attitudes of the merchants and explorers of the newfound nation-states of Europe. The Arawaks brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms, and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Europe's advanced weaponry and resistance to disease, a product of a longer history of close quarters living, allowed them to dominate and decimate large areas of the earth as they roamed the planet in search of riches. Eventually, the European countries established colonial empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia designed to funnel resources and gold to Europe, often using slave labor. This was trade of a particularly exploitative sort, but it served to stimulate Europe tremendously and transform it into a vibrant commercial center. In the process, greed had displaced the feudal prohibitions on such behavior, marking a major shift in ideology and religion. 7. The rise of Protestantism, individualism, and greed. Following close on the heels of the first wave of exploration was the development of Calvinism, the first Protestant religion, in the 1500s. The Catholic Church of the feudal era was primarily concerned with the afterlife, and it explicitly condemned any obsession with the accumulation of worldly possessions and any form of greed. Also, the church was supposed to be the primary focus of the community, not the individual. Individuals were supposed to know their place in society and work to maintain their station in life, not to change it. Calvinists, in contrast, saw hard work and professional activity as one's calling and a sign of godliness. Individual wealth accumulation from hard work was actually considered to be evidence of doing God's work. Additionally, wealth was to be invested in further productive endeavors rather than wasted on luxuries. Even earning income from interest on loans was acceptable as a sign of engaging in a productive, profitable venture. In many ways, Calvinism and later variations of Protestantism provided the ideal ideological support for a market capitalist economic system based on self-interest, greed, hard work, and reinvestment. The idea of improving one's standing in society and celebrating the riches earned through hard work helped foster economic growth. Not surprisingly, it was the nations in which Protestantism took the greatest hold that developed the earliest and most robust market systems. England, in particular, had the strongest departure from Catholicism and embracing of Protestantism when King Henry VIII and the Church of England broke with the papacy in the 1530s. Meanwhile, the earliest forms of capitalist manufacturing were also getting started. 8. The putting out system and the beginnings of capitalist factories. As markets expanded rapidly in the 1500s, merchants operating in export industries needed a larger and more reliable supply of goods to sell. Instead of relying on small, independent craftsmen to produce goods for them, they started the putting out system. The merchant provided the craftsman with the materials. The craftsmen worked the materials into finished products using their tools and skills, and the merchant collected and sold the finished products. Merchants eventually began to set up entire buildings with tools and equipment and hired journeymen and apprentices with the requisite skills, bypassing independent craftsmen entirely. These were the first capitalist factories. Independent craftsmen were gradually replaced by larger-scale factories and workers, breaking down the guilds that had governed production, and turning independent craftsmen into laborers who worked for a merchant capitalist. Merchant capitalists began developing markets for buying and selling inputs, including labor, to use in their new factories. Consider, for a moment, how revolutionary this was. In prior human history, labor had always been allocated based on a social relationship governed by tradition or authority. Now, labor was starting to be allocated to the highest bidder. For the first time in human history, labor and significant amounts of resources were allocated based on money in markets and not by tradition or authority. 9. The monetization of the economy and the decline of the manor. The growing urban populations of Europe needed increasing amounts of food, which they paid for with money earned from manufacturing and trading. Meanwhile, the rural lords wanted additional money to buy all of the new goods that were becoming available. As a result, lords began switching from demanding payments from serfs in fixed amounts of goods, in-kind payments, to demanding payments in fixed amounts of money. Ironically, this set the stage for the economic decline of the manor. As gold from the New World flooded Europe, prices began to rise dramatically. From 1650, prices in Europe increased by between 150 and 400%. Lords found that their fixed payments from serfs bought less and less goods, and many became impoverished. These trends were exacerbated by a significant decline in the population from the Black Death of the 1300s and the 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337–1453. These events wiped out almost 40% of England's population and led to a labor shortage there and elsewhere in Europe. Without enough labor, lords attempted to squeeze the remaining serfs to generate enough money to support the manor. The serfs responded with a series of revolts. The result of the serf resistance, combined with the competition between lords for the labor services of the serfs, led many serfs to gain the status of independent, free peasants with the right to farm their traditional plot as well as the Common lands. This put the rural lords in a desperate situation. Their only recourse was to seize as much land as possible to generate cash to support the manor. 10. The enclosure movement and the establishment of private property rights. To generate cash income, lords began seizing the common lands for their own use. In England, lords fenced off, enclosed, common lands in order to raise sheep for the booming textile industry. Similar patterns followed in continental Europe as lords seized common lands to raise animals or crops that could be sold for cash. By the 1700s, 75–90% of peasants had been forced off of farms all over Europe and into urban slums. This, coupled with a rising population and rising rural rents, meant that cities had huge, desperate populations of former peasants with no means of subsistence. They had no land or tools, and only their labor power to sell. At the same time, the enclosure movement established the legal right of lords to the land they seized. The lords began to use the land as productively as possible to generate the income they needed, and the use of land came to be associated with the amount or revenue or rent that it could bring. Lands were sometimes rented out to others in exchange for money, since money was of higher value to lords than produced goods. Thus, the enclosure movement had the doubly important impact of creating a market for labor power, former serfs and peasants who had to sell their labor in order to survive, and a market for land, which now could be sold or rented. Labor and land had become commodities to be bought and sold. This is a far cry from traditional feudal relationships in which labor was a social obligation and land was a family's estate or plot, both established by birth. We also see how private property can be both constructive and destructive. If a property owner is secure in their ownership of the land for the foreseeable future, they are willing to invest in the productivity of the land by adding irrigation, breeding draft animals, fertilizing, and so on. On the other hand, privatizing the common lands cast millions of peasants into desperate, landless poverty. The culmination of all of these changes in the feudal era was the establishment of the first market-based economic system, mercantilism. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, most of the major cities of England, France, Spain, Belgium, and Holland were incorporated into countries that were dominated by huge merchant capitalists and the monarchs who were allied with them. These merchant capitalists controlled almost all trade and manufacturing.